Atheism is irrational, illogical and immoral. Logical and moral laws undeniably prove existence of God. Let me honestly tell you that, if you are keeping your eyes blind to the most fundamental issues of the logical and moral laws, then you are treading the most slippery routes in your life. The very idea of logical laws presupposes the existence of God as the only viable metaphysical basis for such laws. In recent years it has become fashionable for the atheists to argue that the biblical God doesn't exist, and that the biblical God is even immoral. But the fact is that the very idea of moral laws presupposes the existence of God as the only viable basis for such laws. God cannot be illogical for much the same reason that God cannot be immoral. Atheists profess one thing, but their actions belie this profession. I don't say that atheists never act morally. Atheists feed their children, give money to charity and often make good neighbors. But atheists cannot give a justification for their actions. They are living on borrowed capital of morality from the Christian worldview. Likewise, most religions copy their moral behavior from Christian faith. After that, they try to validate the fundamentals of their false faith by their good actions, the logic of which they had copied from Christian faith. Thus outwardly they pretend to be okay. But inwardly they have no logic for their moral substance. Reasoning involves using the laws of logic. These laws include the law of non-contradiction, which says that you can't have both A and not A, at the same time and in the same relationship. For example, the statement that, my car is in the parking lot, and it is not the case that my car is in the parking lot, is necessarily false by the law of non-contradiction. Any rational person would accept this law. But the question is, why is this law true? Why should there be a law of non-contradiction, or for that matter, any laws of reasoning? The Christian can answer this question. For the Christian there is an absolute standard for reasoning. We are to pattern our thoughts after God's thoughts. The laws of logic are a reflection of the way God thinks. The law of non-contradiction is not simply our personal opinion as to how we ought to think. Rather it stems from God's own self-consistent nature. God cannot deny himself. Hence the way God upholds the universe will necessarily be non-contradictory. The rational reasoning is impossible without the biblical God. Laws of logic are God's standard for thinking. Since God is an unchanging, sovereign, and immaterial being, the laws of logic are abstract, universal, and invariant entities. In other words, they are not made of matter, and they apply everywhere and at all times. The laws of logic are contingent upon God's unchanging nature, and they are necessary for logical reasoning. Thus, rational reasoning would be impossible without the biblical God. The materialistic atheist cannot have the laws of logic, but he uses them, causing inconsistency. He believes that everything that exists is material, and is part of the physical world. But the laws of logic are not physical. Even though the laws of logic cannot exist in the atheist's world, he uses them in his reasoning process. Thus he is inconsistent. Thus he is borrowing from the Christian worldview to argue against the Christian worldview. Hence we again claim that the atheist's view cannot be rational because he uses things like the laws of logic, that cannot exist according to his profession. Hence the debate over the existence of God is a bit like a debate over the existence of air. Can you imagine someone arguing that the air doesn't actually exist? He would offer seemingly excellent proofs against the existence of air, while simultaneously breathing air and expecting that we can hear his words as the sound is transmitted through the air. In order for us to hear and understand his claim, it would have to be wrong. Likewise, the atheist, in arguing that God does not exist, must use laws of logic which would make sense only if God exists. Hence, in order for his argument to make sense, it would have to be wrong. The atheist might say, well, I can reason just fine, and I don't believe in God. But this is no different than the critic of air saying, well, I can breathe just fine, and I don't believe in air. This is not a rational response. He is breathing because air exists, and is reasoning because God exists. The atheist can reason, but his atheism cannot account for his ability to reason. The laws of logic cannot be man-made conventions. But if it were so, then different cultures would have different laws of logic, even mutually contradictory. Thus if the laws of logic are just man-made conventions, then they could not be universal laws. The laws of logic cannot be material, because in that case the atheists use the laws of logic because they work. But the question is, why do the absolute standards of reasoning like the laws of logic exist? How is it that such non-material laws exist if the universe is merely material? The laws of logic are necessary truths and are necessarily true propositions. The propositions are real entities, but they are not physical entities. The laws of logic are necessarily true thoughts. They must exist as true in every possible realm of existence, whether physical or spiritual. If there are necessarily existing thoughts, there must be a necessarily existing mind. If there is a necessarily existing mind, then there must be a necessarily existing person. A necessarily existing person must be a spiritual person, because there is no necessarily existing physical entity. Hence, if there are laws of logic, then there must be a necessarily existing personal, spiritual being called God. The laws of logic are existing. Hence God is existing. The laws of logic that are immaterial, universal, and unchanging require the existence of the Christian God who is eternal, immaterial, and sovereign. If the atheist is willing to concede that immaterial, universal, unchanging entities can exist, why not consider the possibility of God existing? Thus atheism is contrary to logic and against reason. Atheists love to claim that they are men and women of reason. But unfortunately that claim is mere nonsense. Because we have already proved that atheism is contrary to logic and against reason. Their belief in the non-existence of God itself is illogical because to make such a statement you would have to know everything. You would have to search every nook and cranny of the universe, and even beyond and verify that there is no God there. You would have to search every dimension, and verify. But because of the vast size of the universe this is not possible. Hence it is a logical impossibility to make any such absolute negative assertion that God does not exist with absolute certainty. In fact, the God of the Bible does exist in a place you cannot look and see. The atheists self-contradict in saying, you can't make absolute statements that apply to everybody. Then immediately, they just make an absolute statement that applies to everybody, including God, that God does not exist. That is the so-called logic of the atheist. Miserably silly and irrational. Moreover, the atheists are self-righteous. Along with telling us that they are using reason to arrive at their dogmatic belief in the non-existence of God, the atheists like to tell us another lie: you don't need God to be a good person. In other words, atheists claim they are good people even without any help from a supposed God. Think about that statement for a moment. Atheists like to accuse Christians of being holier than thou, or self-righteous. But any Christian who takes the Bible seriously realizes that he is not a good person at all. So who, against both logic and experience, is the self-righteous one? The Christian who realizes that everything good is a gift from God, or the atheist who is proud about what a good person he is? Thus in all spheres of reasoning, atheism is a total failure, a total farce, a total deception. The gospel of Jesus Christ is the best philosophy. The greatest minds of all times, in all fields of knowledge, have accepted it with awe and reverence. The gospel of Jesus is extremely challenging and rewarding, both intellectually and spiritually, as nothing else. This Christian faith is not an old-fashioned mythological story, but is the most systematic, comprehensive and logical belief system, with the most substantial historical evidences available to mankind. It is the only faith which could independently and authoritatively claim that salvation is possible only through one divine historical person. The most logical and safest position, for any person, is accepting Jesus as his Savior and God. Because the believer in Jesus will have eternal bliss, if he is right, and lose nothing, even if he is wrong. Because no belief system in the world claims that, simply because one believes in Jesus, one will go to hell. But on the other hand, those who reject Jesus have the infinitely dangerous alternative of eternal damnation in hell. Because the Bible, which is the most authentic source of spiritual information on earth, categorically warns that those who reject Jesus shall be punished with eternal hell.